Hello everyone, welcome to my virtual talk, Pattern Law for Puzzlers, which was an idea buzzing around my brain. I wanted to turn it into a talk just to see how it would work out. Anyway, so this is about the European problem solution analysis for puzzle insights. Let me elaborate. So, by way of background, making good puzzles is a creative and a subjective endeavour. There's no single objective process for puzzle creation, but I believe it is possible to have a semi-objective assessment of puzzles. So here's the scope of my talk. It brings together my patent law nerdery with my adventure game nerdery. I am making an adventure game as a solo dev, and I'm a European and UK patent attorney. So in the middle we have this intersection where you're going to get one of the nerdiest talks you've ever heard in your life. And just to be clear, on the axis of insight to shits and giggles, I am aiming more for the far end, despite the potentially dry subject matter. So wish me luck. So let's look at some terminology to sort of put this in the right framework. So a puzzle at its essence involves a problem to be solved and a solution to that problem. If you are coming at this from a patent attorney angle, you will see maybe where I'm going with this. In a modern adventure game, a puzzle may involve a sequence of problems leading to a solution, what I would call a progressive puzzle. John Ingold gave a very good talk at Develop very recently, Deduction as Exploration in TR49. It's a very exciting game. The concept basically is that you have a sequence of different setups so that you have increasingly obvious clues, so players will find a solution at the limit of their reasoning ability, so everyone gets to feel smart. That's the basic principle. This is not an entirely new concept, but as a fundamental design philosophy, it's more of a modern thing, I guess. Because in old adventure games, if you get stuck, you're shit out of luck. Anybody who remembers playing adventure games in the 80s and 90s will know exactly what I'm talking about. We'll come back to some of those. So a problem does not exist in isolation. A problem exists in the context of prior knowledge. Prior knowledge includes game lore, anything communicated to the user by the game, which includes facts and narrative. If you've got a sort of more puzzle-based game, these will be literal facts. But in, say, a more free-form adventure game, if it's graphical, it'll be things people have said, items, environments, and so on. You've also got genre conventions, which may set expectations for the kinds of puzzle and maybe the kinds of solutions. So text adventure games have certain conventions. Point-and-click adventure games have certain conventions, and so on. And if you've got a code breaker game, the conventions will probably become clear as the game unfolds. And you also have common general knowledge. Again, anybody who comes at this from a pattern angle will be seeing increasingly where I'm going with this. And this is anything that you are assumed to know that is not intrinsic to the game or the genre. So simple things like what letter follows what letter in the alphabet. So if you've got a code breaker game, you may well assume people know what the alphabet is. That's reasonable. Names of the week and so on. But something like a list of the kings and queens of England, especially for a localised game, is probably outside what we'd call strict common general knowledge. You might know where you can go to find that information, but that information is not something you perhaps assume people will know. So as a common general knowledge, which you may see referred to as CGK, it's wide but it's shallow, and code-based puzzles can lean into it especially heavily, I think. A good puzzle is fair. This is more of an assertion than terminology. What do we mean by fair? I mean that you can solve the puzzle with the available information, that being game lore, the genre conventions, and common general knowledge, and any context the puzzle is given. An unfair puzzle is non-obvious, even if you possess all the available information. that is again more an assertion, and I'm slightly hammering a square peg into a round hole, but bear with me. Therefore, a fair puzzle is obvious in view of all available information. And what do I mean by obvious? Well, it's a specialist meaning in this context, because I don't think many people who were on the adventure game side will be nodding their heads going, yes, that's absolutely what it is. And it's a bit of a stretch, but bear with me because it does all tie things together. So obvious in this context is not a measure of how easy something is. And there are some things we can say about obviousness. So from a single starting point, one solution may be obvious and another solution may be non-obvious. But the same solution may be non-obvious from one starting point and obvious from another. And some things appear obvious in hindsight only. A solution can sound obvious when somebody tells it to you, but it's very non-obvious while you're trying to find it. And it's true that normally we think that we don't want to be making puzzles that are obvious. That sounds like a bad thing, but again, please bear with me. Now, if only there was some deep, well-tested area of law we could draw on to provide some clarity and insight. Shazam Kapow, the European Patent Convention, and in particular case law of the Boards of Appeal of the European Patent Office. Try and contain your excitement. So the reason I have mentioned these things is that we see here the definition of inventive step in Europe. For a patent to be granted, it must satisfy various criteria. It must be new, novel, and it must be inventive. There are other criteria in other countries. In the US, an invention must be non-obvious. This is a subtle but important distinction. But in Europe, an invention must be not obvious to a person skilled in the art. So the point is, there is a deep and wide, no, not very wide, there's a very deep area of case law in patents on what is obvious. So if we're defining puzzles, as being obvious, we can have some guidance to let us understand what is fair. So the reason I've chosen Europe in particular is there is a famous problem solution test to determine whether an invention is obvious to a person skilled in the art. And the central thesis of my talk is that a semi-objective assessment of the fairness, by which I mean the obviousness of puzzles, can be devised by adapting case law relating to this test. So I'm going to translate some examples of case law relating to obviousness to produce some principles that we can apply to puzzles. And I'll tell you a little bit about patent law, but you don't need to know that. That's only if you're interested. Some people are interested. So this is at the heart of it. This is how you assess inventive step in Europe, in theory. So this is the problem solution approach, and it has several steps. People love having several steps in the law. It's very exciting. So first step is to determine the closest prior art. So in a patent context, this is documents, patent applications that have gone before, which are the closest thing to your invention. Selecting which one is the closest one is part of the game. Next step is you assess technical results achieved by the claimed invention when compared to the closest state of the art. Basically, what is the new bit? What is the solution that your invention provides relative to that closest prior art? And then having figured that out, you sort of reverse engineer what the problem is that you've solved. And the problem depends on what the prior art is and what your solution is. So it may not be the problem you set out to solve, may not be what you say you've done in your patent application, but this is what objectively has been solved by the technical solution. This involves a bit of lateral thinking, but it's relatively objective. And then the last stage is you consider whether the solution, starting from the closest prior art and bearing in mind the problem, would it have been obvious to the skilled person? So at the very end of this, you get a massively circular sort of definition, but bear with me, it does get a little better. So I'm going to tweak this for puzzles. So, and this is a bit of an approximation, but let's say in the first step, you're determining the prior knowledge. You determine your puzzle solution, you determine the problem to solve, and then you ask yourself, is the solution obvious, starting from the prior knowledge and the problem? So let's put this in a little bit more clear format. So our new problem solution approach for puzzle analysis is step A, determine the prior knowledge, which is the game law, the genre conventions, the common general knowledge. Determine the puzzle solution, what the player must actually provide. So this might be an action the player must do, it might be a code that they type in. Determine the problem that the player must solve to provide that, and this may not be the question that you posed in your game. It is objectively what was the problem. So it might be realizing that something needs to be done, as well as what you have to do. And then you determine if the solution is obvious, starting from the prior knowledge with the aim of solving a problem. And if it is obvious, then the puzzle is definitely fair. That is my thesis. So what is obvious then? We're still going around in circles. So I'm now going to provide a few rules based very loosely on the patent law definitions. So for patents, you get a whole lot of examples of what is and is not obvious. You have to really go down to examples for this because, as I said, it's quite circular. So you've just got to make some calls for particular kinds of subject matter as to what is and is not obvious. And this has been tested over decades by lots of clever people, cleverer than me for sure. And they may not have got it all, quotes, right, but there's a very deep area of law to tell you what is and is not obvious. But the main criteria, I would say, the overriding consideration is this, quote, simple, quotes, principle of could-would. So if, so to start from the closest prior art with the technical problem, you're not asking whether the skilled person, that's somebody working in the relevant field, let's ignore that for some puzzles. It's not whether you could have done something, it's whether you would have done something. So if there is an available solution, the player could choose it, but for it to be obvious, for it to be a fair puzzle, my suggestion is the player would pick it. There must be something directing them to that solution. So it's not enough that a player could think of a solution. For the solution to be obvious and therefore fair, it is necessary that they would discover it. So you have to be directed towards the solution. That may be the context of the puzzle, or it may be, and this gets back to slightly circular, vague stuff, if the solution is self-evident in some way, has a self-evident appeal. And so moving on, this is still kind of fundamental stuff, so I'm going to talk about it on the patent side too. You have to avoid hindsight analysis, which they call ex post facto analysis, because you've got to use some Latin or else it's not proper law. So there's a lot of case law on how to avoid that, and the problem solution test is asserted to be a way to do that. You do need to have a slight mental accommodation and adjustment of how you see things to do this. It's not entirely, quotes, obvious, quotes, how to do this. But turning this into concrete advice for puzzles, the main thing is not to underestimate how difficult simple puzzles can be. You can see this problem, you can see the solution, you say, oh yeah, of course that's findable. But I have some experience in setting exams for patent attorneys. And I remember setting an exam for the amendment paper where I was like, right, let's put in some tricky bits that the best people will spot. And you want to make it a clever puzzle for people to solve. And the fellow examiner's like, why are you doing that? This is ridiculous. Make it a simple test. When you make it a simple test with a simple thing to spot, half the people fail. They don't see it. It's you have to get deep into this sort of stuff to understand how obvious things are. And to some people, stuff is remarkably obvious, and some people that's going to be one kind of player. But a lot of players, you really do need to guide them, and just following simple directions without too many distracting alternatives can be a rewarding and difficult experience for most people. So that's what I'd say about that. And there's a lot of stuff in patent law about how you come to a particular selection of an information source, which would be a patent document, or but again, if you've got different starting points for the player in your game law, then you really need to give them something to direct them towards the source to use. And players can still miss that. Moving on to another sort of key principle I'm going to talk about because it's important is that when you're looking at prior art documents to determine what they say, you've got to look at the entirety of it. You can't cherry pick pieces that may be in conflict with other bits of the document. So really, puzzles too, you've got to consider the totality of information you're given to a player rather than assume people will focus on one bit for no good reason. So that's quite important, I think. And now we're getting into sort of more gimmicky stuff where I'm going to try and tease out some advice from things that are not strictly on point. So there's a lot of stuff in patents about how you combine elements. But this is more of a vague sort of thing. But if you require a combination of elements, the player's got to have some expectation of success for making that combination. There must be something pointing to why this would be a good combination. Otherwise, the solution is not obvious, and therefore, according to my thesis, it is unfair. And again, players will miss all kinds of pointers, you'd be surprised. So next up, we have a couple of unrelated bits. So really what I'm drawing from this is that a combination of features makes for a better puzzle if there's synergy between the features. And if that synergy is signposted or very obvious, it's satisfying to have a puzzle like that. In the same way that an invention is inventive if there is a synergy between the combination. It's not merely just putting A and B together to make something new. And that's the whole point about inventive step. It's not enough to have an invention that is new. It's got to be in some sense clever. That's how I sort of phrase that. And then a little sort of specific thing that, the older one thing is that you're combining with a new thing, the less obvious it is. And in extreme cases, things can be not obvious to combine simply because of the age of one of them. But I'd say that means that you've now got an unfair puzzle. So try not to have your clues too far apart because it's a bit of a cheap way to make it not obvious. And here we go. There's some really specific stuff. So I'm just going to go with my inferences. So if a solution is known to one problem, it may be obvious, therefore fair, to apply it to another. So if you see a character in your game solving a puzzle in one way, then it's reasonable to expect the player to solve another puzzle in the same way. This stuff is quotes obvious, quotes maybe, but again, it's useful just to sort of run through some of these things. You can expect a player to combine different kinds of principles to solve a puzzle, but you need to have the principles clearly signposted. I think combining different principles without any pointer to it is unfair. And this is an interesting one because this varies by jurisdiction, the patents. In Europe, you're normally looking at maybe you combine two patent documents, which is two bits of information the game's given out. And here it's saying you can have more than two, but generally speaking, you don't combine more than two things in Europe to make an inventive step attack. And similarly, I think you don't want to be needing to combine more than two elements in a puzzle as a general rule. But the thing is that in the UK, you're looking more at combining a patent document with common general knowledge. So that's a different kind of puzzle, which is taking a piece of information given by the game and sort of thinking around it a bit. What if I change the letters to a different one? What if I reverse the alphabet? And those, I think, are slightly harder puzzles, but still fair. But it's going to change the character of your game if you are leaning into common general knowledge. So not unfair, but you want to signpost that your game is largely about using your common general knowledge. And you have to assume very shallow common general knowledge. What if a player in China doesn't have the same cultural touchstones? And how, if it's a puzzle involving alphabet stuff, how is that going to localize? That's a whole other problem, but anyway. And in the US, you have a different sort of approach that non-obviousness is the criteria, and US examiners will combine 5, 6 different patent documents to say that your claim is obvious. It's a very different approach there. And all I will say is I don't want to play a puzzle game that follows the US standard of obviousness. I'm not saying any more than that. Selection inventions. Again, another big bit of patent law, but I'm going to skip over it and say a puzzle involving selecting a specific value or one element from a set of elements that you're given, it can be fair. But so long as there are pointers to either the selection to make or pointers on how to make that selection, what are the criteria for making the selection? So just picking random stuff is brute forcing, and it's not really fun. And this is a big stretch from the source, but puzzle can involve changing a sequence of operations, but you probably need to signpost the type of solution that you require for that to be fair. An interesting one here is that sometimes, as an invention, a puzzle can involve the correct identification of the problem to be solved, rather than the solution. So these are quite rare, but they're quite satisfying to see these sort of inventions. If this is the case, you probably want the solution to be self-evident, but it still may not be fair, because spotting a problem, you're not going to have pointers to that, because how it works. So those are some examples. I have gone through a lot of other things. I won't go through that because it's diminishing returns, and I don't think anybody's that interested in the case law of the European Boards of Appeal. My apologies to the European Boards of Appeal. But I'm going to present them as subjectively arranged orders of obviousness, from hard and unfair to easy and obvious. This is arbitrary, but hopefully this is a useful takeaway. And then I'll present an ordering of the hints. So if you're going to give hints to give players more of a chance to find your desired solution, these are maybe give you some inspiration on what hints to provide at what stage. Drawn from this study I've done, but kind of, generally useful, hopefully. And I hope this will help you to create and evaluate puzzles. So let's crack on. So what are the things that are hard and unfair? So some of these I've covered already. So if you ask the player to solve a different problem to one you have explicitly posed, that's not going to be obvious, that's unfair. If the player's got to figure out the problem to be solved and the solution is not then apparent, I think that's too much. If a player has to ignore a contrary teaching provided by the game, there can be examples where you decide you have an unreliable narrator, but if the game says pick a colour it can't be red and the answer is red, that's unfair. If you have to overcome a common general knowledge prejudice against the solution, where you're asked to pick something that's going to float in water, but it doesn't float in water, but in your game world it does. If you want to play that sort of game, you've got to have clear signposting that you are playing by different rules. But generally, that's a bit of a difficult puzzle. If you have to rely on game information that is contrary to common general knowledge, again, it can work, but take care, because players may maybe forget they were given that information. If you have to consider an analogy to an everyday item, the point being relying on a knowledge of everyday items that isn't given in the game, you may be assuming too much of common general knowledge, too much of its depth. If you're asking players to combine elements without any pointers, so this can be in a broad sense, put the lime in the coconut, if there's nothing to guide them there, that's not a fair thing. If you're asking to make a selection of a value or an element from a set without any pointers, not fair. And also, if you need players to put things in the solution which don't have any part in solving the problem, this is unfair. There's no reason for them to have included those elements. How would they know? And if you ask players to provide a solution that simply does not work, again, there's no incentive, there's no expectation of success. So it's not fair to ask players to do that. Moving on to things that are hard, maybe still unfair, but are just hard puzzles. if you've got to figure the problem to be solved, but the solution is self-evident once you've done that. That's hard, but it's an interesting kind of puzzle. If players have to select one source of information, but the solution is evident once you've made that selection, that's a little bit vague and abstract, but if you've got books you can look at for a solution, but once you've chosen a book, the solution is obvious from that book. That's making the player do a bit of work, but that's a reasonable puzzle. And if you've got to combine elements, but you're guided on how to evaluate what combination is good, that's fair. If you've got to select a specific value or element from a set, but you're guided on how to evaluate that selection, and if you have to combine principles of the same type in order to solve the puzzle, here's a book of ways to pick balloons. A balloon must have a colour that begins with R. A balloon must, that's fine. And if you've got to combine principles of different types, if that is signposted, so you need to use one of the balloon rules, you need to use one of the weight rules, and if you need to combine information but it's presented very far apart, it can be fair, but it's on the harder side, as we discussed earlier. And if you need to combine more than two different sources of information, maybe even combining two sources of information is hard. And if you need to change the sequence of a series of steps, that's just contaminated. And maybe these are sort of more medium puzzles. You've got to select one source of information, but you're guided to that specific choice. Similarly, you have to combine elements. Not similarly, this is a different one. You combine elements, but the combination is signposted or very synergistic. And if you select a specific value or element from a set, but you're guided to that particular choice rather than just the criteria. And if you need to combine two different sources of information, but it's kind of obvious when you do. And if you have to manually test the suitability of different elements, which you've been led to consider as a whole. So put A into the test slot, press the button. Put B into the test slot, press the button. Not necessarily the most fun, but a different kind of puzzle. If you have to substitute an element for one having the same functionality, you have a conductor, but it's not an appropriate conductor. Let's put the iron cube in instead. And if you are given a solution that is spelled out and you've got to apply it to a new use, this is how we make green balloons float. And you've got a red balloon. And now here are some perhaps the easier ones. This is a subjective assessment, I mean, make it what you will. But generally speaking, and this is a sort of abstract thing, the solution is predictable, or has a self-evident, reasonable expectation of success. You've got a feather and an iron cube, and you need to put something that will sink to the bottom of water. You're not telling people which one is light, but there's such a predictable solution, or it's so obvious which one is going to succeed. If the solution is known as a solution for a related problem, that is signposted as such. And if the solution can be brute forced from a defined set of possible solutions without any downsides. So in John Ingolf's talk I referred to earlier, he mentioned that they will penalise the player in subtle and less subtle ways for brute forcing solutions. But if you let that happen without any consequences, that's kind of easy. And if there are multiple routes to a solution, if you give players lots of ways to solve something, then that can make the solution easier. Though if the routes are all hard, then the solution is still hard. And so that's that. And then if you're giving hints, this is just a few things where I'm kind of sorting it from low to high obviousness. So if you need to start giving the player pointers, here's where you might start. So you could hint at the problem to be solved. You can hint at the type of solution required. Ensure that all the relevant information is being presented recently to avoid the sort of the old information bias. You can state the problem that the player's got to solve. You can suggest an area of general knowledge that can be combined with the information. You can hint at the particular information source. Oh, you should consider this book maybe. Let the player explore the effect of choosing different solutions. Put the thing in the test slot, press the button. and you can sort of refresh the player with relevant information so they know exactly what they've got to use. You can mention specifically what general knowledge to apply, use the reversed alphabet to do this. You can hint at a combination of elements according to a principle, and hint at a very specific combination of elements. I'll give you an example of that. And you can list alternative solutions to pick from, or to brute force. Or you can just give the actual solution as the last resort. And sometimes, if you want to keep the narrative moving rather than focus on the puzzles, this is what you want to do. So here's just a reminder before I look at a couple of examples. This is our problem solution approach for puzzle analysis. Determine the prior knowledge, determine the solution, you determine the problem the player has to solve, which again may not be the question you've actually asked. You may not have asked a question at all. And you determine if that solution is obvious. If it's obvious, the puzzle is fair. So here's an example from the game I have in development. This is a tutorial level. And you start, there's a ladder going to somewhere you want to be. And you climb the ladder, a rung breaks off. And you're a robot, you can't climb a ladder without a rung. So you may call this a contrived puzzle, and I would not disabuse you of that notion. And the game very clearly signposts you need to fix the ladder to proceed. You can tell the game is written by a patent attorney because it literally has a box saying, here are the problems. This is a problem. The ladder is broken. I need to fix it. And you start in a single location. There's just a few things. There's a workbench. There's a wrench on the workbench. There's a pile of sand. The workbench and the sand are not relevant. And the game signposts very clearly that you can examine things to get more information. So it's reasonable to assume that the user is going to start examining things. And if the user doesn't, a hint will pop up saying, have you really considered examining things? But at this point, the solution is not obvious, and therefore not fair. But if you follow a sequence of things you're suggested to do, you examine the ladder, it says there's a recess where the rung used to be, with 2 holes on either side where the rung used to fit in. If you examine that recess, and that's perhaps the biggest leap. If you examine the recess, you're told it's 40 centimetres wide. If you examine the wrench, the game tells you that it is fully seized up and about 40 centimetres long. So do you see what I'm getting at? So I'd say the solution at this point is fair. It requires a combination of 2 elements, the wrench and the recess, that has now been clearly signposted. So you put the wrench in the recess, and then you've made a new rung. There are actually different solutions to that. There's one other solution, which isn't obvious from what I've told you here. But, you know, I think that's fair. So, in a sense, what you see here is a sequence, a puzzle progression, where maybe you're good and you think to put the wrench in the ladder without examining anything. Maybe you think, you know, if you've played a lot of adventure games, that's the kind of thing you might come up with. So the person who thinks that will think they're very clever because they did that without having to get into the details. And if you still don't get it, the game will then start giving you hints. And I think it will say something along the lines of, maybe you need to put something in the ladder. You know, it says, have you examined the ladder? Have you examined the recess in the ladder? Have you thought about putting something in the recess of the ladder? So it's giving you a different problem to solve. The problem is not, how do I fix the ladder? The problem is, what do I put in the ladder to fix it? And then you've got a very small number of options to do that. And if you still don't get it, because you're new to the genre, for example, it will say, have you tried putting a wrench in the recess? So, you know, and if you can't get it there, it's not the game for you. I think I'm fair to say. So that's sort of applying those principles. But I'm not necessarily a good puzzle setter. I'm not a good, you know, I'm not an expert in the field, but that's that. But at the other end, a famous puzzle is the Babelfish puzzle, where you've got a vending machine, and if the player presses a button, a Babelfish is vended, but it flies across the room and into a hole. So if you have the good idea to hang your dressing gown on the hook above the hole, fish hits the gown and falls down the drain. If you block the drain with the towel you're holding, the fish lands on the towel and is then cleaned away by a cleaning robot, which comes out of a hole covered by a panel and goes back into the hole covered by a panel. If you have the I'd say, more difficult intuition to block the panel with a satchel. The robot picks up the fish, runs into the satchel and throws the fish in the air, and then another robot appears and cleans it away. And at that point, you're feeling like the game is a hostile entity. And the final part of the solution involves placing some junk mail on top of the satchel. So when the fish shoots out, hits the ground, lands on the towel, the robot comes out to clean it, hits the satchel, it throws the junk mail in the air as well as the fish. And the second cleaning robot is too busy sorting out the junk mail to catch the fish. The fish goes into the player's ear. So this is a hard puzzle, notoriously, but they would make T-shirts to say, "I solved the babelfish puzzle." One thing to say, if you're looking at it from the invention side, is this one solution or is it several? It's an iterative process. I think we're looking at 5 separate puzzles here, and each one has a solution that is not signposted. I don't think any of these are signposted, so therefore you could say that they're at least borderline unfair. Could you make it fairer if you had some progressive steps in that, or hints? That would be difficult. But I think maybe, I don't know the wording. I haven't seen the wording in a while, so maybe there are pointers given. But it's a hard time. I think perhaps the very last step is the most unfair, to think, that logical step of put some junk mail and that's going to distract her. But I think that is too much. I would never have solved this. I'm useless at adventure games, which is maybe ironic, but I've got the wrong kind of brain, I think. Anyway, so to conclude, I don't think the central principle stands up terribly well. I think this whole thing about obviousness, you were probably cringing at that. I think it's an interesting thing to explore. I hope I've shed some light. I hope I've made both the pattern side and the puzzle side adequately clear. I think it's an interesting idea. That's why I've done this talk. I think many classic puzzles are unfair according to these rules, but they are both popular and solvable. Some people have a particular flair for solving adventure games. Some people have a flair for solving cryptic crosswords, and you can get better at that with time. But also, I think some people have the right kind of brain for that. So you may want to go deeper than I've suggested in terms of the hardness and non-obviousness of puzzles. But as long as you provide progressive systems to allow players with a less lateral brain to solve the puzzles, I think for my game, certainly, my priority is not the puzzles. My priority is the overall narrative. I want players to play the game, feel like they've solved some puzzles, but mainly find out what happens next. What is the story in my game? And I think that's more of a modern concept, and having progressive systems is a modern concept. The Old Skies, the last point and click I played, had nothing was really unsolvable. You could there was a slight hint mechanism. It was progressive, and I think it was satisfying for that. I finished the game. That is satisfying. I got the story. The story of that game is clearly a big part of it. It's an emotional story. There's a lot of emotional parts of it. So that, I think, is the modern adventure game experience. So if nothing else, I think I provided a new framework for considering puzzles, and I hope that the orders of obviousness list I gave can provide some inspiration. And hopefully there's a few more tools for your puzzle creation toolbox. I hope that even experienced puzzle setters will look at this and go, well, that's a different way of looking at it. Maybe that's interesting. And if there's something you're stuck on, maybe use this to help unlock why your puzzle doesn't feel right, or how you can make it more accessible. And hopefully you understand Inventive Step in Europe a little better. So thank you very much for your time. And if you're interested to follow up on the patent side, there's a whole lot you can do there. But the EPO guidelines for examination are a sort of clearer explanation of some of these concepts. And there's the link there. The case law of the EPO Boards of Appeal was my primary source for this. That's kind of dry. That's hard going, but there it is if you want it. And my game, currently that links to my LinkedIn page, but it will eventually link to the Steam store page. If you're interested, I'm very happy to talk at length about my game, but that is not the main purpose of this talk. So again, thank you very much for listening. I hope that all made sense and made your life brighter on this wonderful day. All right, bye then.